Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about one of the most disturbing, most talked about, and most emotionally overwhelming made-for-television movies of 2021. The movie is called Girl in the Basement, and if you have not seen it yet, or if you simply want to understand what this film is really about, what it is based on, who made it, who stars in it, and why it shook so many viewers around the world, then you are in exactly the right place. Stay with me because we are going to break down every single detail of this film from the very beginning. Where this movie comes from and who made it. Before we get into the overview and the plot, it is very important to understand where this movie comes from, because that background gives the entire film a completely different weight. Girl in the Basement is an American television movie. It was produced in the United States and it aired on the Lifetime Network, which is a cable channel known for producing dramatic, real-life inspired stories, particularly those centered around women and serious social issues. The movie was directed by Elizabeth Rome, who is an actress and director known for her work in television. The screenplay was written by Barbara Nance. The film was produced under the banner of Lifetime Original Movies, which means it was made specifically for the Lifetime channel and was not Now here is the most important piece of context. Girl in the Basement is not a purely fictional story. It is inspired by a real-life case that shocked the entire world when it came to light in 2008. The film is based on the true story of Elisabeth Fritzl, an Austrian woman whose father, Joseph Fritzl, imprisoned her in a basement dungeon beneath their family home in Amstetten, Austria, for 24 years, from 1984 to 2008. During that time, she was subjected to unimaginable abuse and gave birth to 7 children, all fathered by her own father. When the case was finally uncovered, it became one of the most horrifying criminal cases in modern European history. The film changes the names and some details, but the core of the story is directly drawn from this real case. So when you watch this movie, you are watching a dramatized version of something that actually happened to a real person. Overview. Girl in the Basement is a dark, disturbing, and deeply emotional drama that explores themes of abuse, captivity, control, family trauma, and survival. The film centers on a teenage girl named Sarah who lives with her family in what appears to be a normal suburban household. Her father, Don, is charming and well-liked on the surface, but behind closed doors he is a deeply controlling and abusive man. As Sarah approaches adulthood and begins to assert her independence, Don becomes increasingly threatened by her growing confidence and her desire to escape his control. On the eve of her 18th birthday, he lures her into the basement of their home and locks her inside, beginning a nightmare that lasts for decades. The film is difficult to watch because it does not shy away from the horror of what Sarah endures. It is told in a way that shifts between the outside world, where Don maintains his carefully constructed image of a normal family man, and the basement, where the real and devastating truth is hidden. The film is a survival story at its heart, and it is also a story about the terrifying way that abusers operate in plain sight, while those around them remain completely unaware. Plot details. The story begins with Sarah as a bright and energetic teenager who dreams of leaving home, going to college, and living her own life. She has a boyfriend and a future she is looking forward to. Her relationship with her father, Don, is tense. He is domineering, possessive, and obsessed with maintaining total. On the night before her 18th birthday, Don tells Sarah he needs her help with something in the basement. The moment she goes downstairs, he locks the door behind her. That door does not open again for many years. Don has constructed a hidden underground space beneath the family home where he imprisons Sarah. He visits her regularly, subjecting her to abuse, and over the years Sarah gives birth to Meanwhile, upstairs, life continues. Don's wife, Janet, lives completely unaware of what is happening beneath her feet. Don tells her and the outside world that Sarah has run away from home. He maintains this lie for years, presenting himself to neighbors and friends as a grieving father whose daughter simply abandoned the family. People believe him because he is charismatic and because no one wants to believe that something so horrific could be happening in an ordinary home on an ordinary street. As years pass, some of the children that Sarah gives birth to in the basement are brought upstairs by Don, who tells Janet that Sarah has been leaving these children on their doorstep because she cannot care for them. Incredibly, Janet and the community accept this explanation. Don essentially raises two separate families at the same time, one above ground and one hidden in a basement, all while keeping his secret intact through manipulation, control, and calculated deception. Sarah's life in the basement is portrayed with immense pain and emotional weight. She tries to maintain her sanity, to protect her children, and to keep some small sense of herself alive through the years of captivity. The film does not show gratuitous detail, but it makes sure the viewer understands the depth of what she is suffering. Her resilience is one of the most powerful elements of the story. The turning point comes when one of the children born in the basement becomes critically ill and requires urgent medical attention. This forces Don to allow the child to be taken to a hospital, which begins to unravel the carefully maintained web of lies he has constructed. Medical professionals and investigators start asking questions that Don cannot answer. The truth slowly begins to surface, and ultimately Sarah is discovered. She is brought out of the basement and into the outside world after years of captivity. The final portion of the film deals with the aftermath, the shock, the disbelief of those who knew Don, the legal consequences he faces, and Sarah's painful first steps toward trying to rebuild her life. The ending is not a clean or easy resolution because the real story never was. It is a quiet and sober conclusion that leaves the audience reflecting on the magnitude of what Sarah endured and survived. Cast. The cast of Girl in the Basement is led by Stephanie Scott, who plays Sarah, the young woman at the center of the story. Stephanie Scott delivers a performance that carries the entire film. She has to portray Sarah from her teenage years through years of captivity and into adulthood, and she does so with a level of emotional depth and physical commitment that makes the film as powerful as it is. Scott is best known to many viewers from her role in Insidious, Chapter 3, but her performance in this film is arguably the most demanding and impressive work of her career. Playing Don, Sarah's father and the primary antagonist of the film, is Judd Nelson. Nelson is a veteran actor widely known for his role in The Breakfast Club, one of the most iconic films of the 1980s. His casting here is deliberately somewhat counterintuitive, placing a recognizable and even likable screen presence in the role of a monster, which adds an additional layer of unease to the film. His performance is cold, calculated, and deeply unsettling without resorting to theatrical villainy. He plays Don as a man who is utterly convinced of his own authority, which makes him all the more frightening. Joely Fisher plays Janet, Don's wife, Sarah's mother. Her character is a deeply tragic figure, a woman who is herself a victim of Don's manipulation and who is kept in the dark about the truth happening in her own home. Fisher brings a genuine heartbreak to the role, and her character's eventual confrontation with reality is one of the most emotionally gutting moments in the film. The supporting cast includes Emily Topper and other actors who play Sarah's children and various other figures in the story. The performances throughout are solid and grounded, which serves the serious and sensitive nature of the material well. Release date and broadcast information. Girl in the Basement premiered on the Lifetime Network on February 27, 2021. It was broadcast in the United States as a Lifetime original movie. Like most Lifetime productions, it was made for television and was not given a theatrical release. Following its premiere, it became available on various streaming and on-demand platforms associated with the Lifetime Network. The film generated significant attention and discussion immediately after its release, with many viewers expressing how emotionally impacted they were by the story. It trended on social media in the days following its premiere and sparked widespread conversations about abuse, captivity, and the real case that inspired it. Why this movie matters. Girl in the Basement is not easy viewing. It is the kind of film that stays with you long after it ends. What makes it significant beyond just being a dramatic television movie is that it brings a real story to a wide audience. The case of Elisabeth Fritzl happened in Austria and received global news coverage in 2008, but for many younger viewers or those who were not following international news at the time, this film may be the first time they encountered this story in a detailed and human way. By putting faces and emotions to the story, the film forces viewers to reckon with the reality that abuse can happen anywhere, that abusers are often the last people anyone would suspect, and that victims can be hidden in plain sight for years while the world continues on around them completely unaware. The film also raises important questions about how communities, families, and institutions can fail to see warning signs, and how abusers use social manipulation as a weapon just as surely as they use physical force. These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Final thoughts. Girl in the Basement is a powerful, harrowing, and important film. It is not entertainment in a light sense. It is the kind of movie that demands something from its audience, and what it demands is attention, empathy, and a willingness to sit with very difficult emotions. The performances are strong, the direction is focused, and the story, rooted in real events, carries a weight that fictional dramas often cannot match. If you want to understand what happened in the Rio Fritzl case through a dramatized lens, or if you simply want to see a serious and well-made television drama about survival against the most unimaginable circumstances, this film deserves your time. Girl in the Basement, 2021, complete story in full detail. The beginning, Sarah's life before the basement. The story begins in what looks, on the surface, like a completely ordinary American household. There is a house, a family, a mother, a father, and children. From the outside, nothing about this home raises any alarm. The neighborhood is quiet, the family is known, and the father, whose name is Don, is a man that people in the community seem to respect. He is the kind of man who knows how to carry himself in public, how to smile at the right moments, how to say the right things to the right people. Nobody looks at Don and sees a monster. That is precisely the point. That is precisely what makes him so dangerous. Inside the home, however, the reality is something very different. Don rules the household with an iron grip. Everything is about control. He decides what happens, when it happens, and how it happens. His wife, Janet, is a quiet and somewhat passive woman who has spent years accommodating Don's moods, his demands, and his authority. She is not a weak person, but she is a person who has been worn down over time by living with a man who controls everything around him. She loves her family and she tries to keep the peace, and keeping the peace in that house means not questioning Don. At the center of the story is Sarah. She is a teenage girl who is full of life, full of energy, full of dreams. She has a personality that is too bright and too big to be contained, and that quality in her is something that deeply unsettles her father. Sarah wants things. She has a boyfriend she cares about. She has a future she can see ahead of her, a future that involves leaving the house, going to college, experiencing the world beyond the walls her father has built around the family. She is on the verge of adulthood, and adulthood in Sarah's mind means freedom. It means escaping the suffocating control of her father. Don watches Sarah's growing independence with something that goes beyond a normal parent's concern. What he feels is something darker, something that crosses every line of what a father is supposed to feel toward a daughter. His obsession with her, his need to control her, his inability to accept that she is becoming her own person, all of this has been building for years. As Sarah gets closer to her 18th birthday, the tension inside that house becomes almost unbearable. Sarah pushes back. She argues. She asserts herself. And every time she does, something in Don shifts further into a place that no person should ever go. The night before Sarah's 18th birthday is the last night she will spend as a free person for many, many years. The trap, the night everything changed. Don approaches Sarah and tells her he needs her help with something downstairs. He uses the kind of casual, ordinary language that disarms suspicion. There is nothing in his tone that signals danger. He is her father. The basement is part of their home. Sarah goes down the stairs with him, thinking nothing of it, perhaps even hoping that this is a moment where they can settle some of their tension. She is almost an adult. Maybe he is finally ready to treat her like one. The moment she crosses the threshold into the basement, Don moves quickly. He leaves. He closes the door behind him. Sarah hears the sound of a lock. She calls out. She tries the door. It does not open. She calls again, louder. Nothing. She screams. Still nothing. The realization of what is happening crashes over her in waves. She is locked in. She is trapped. The door is solid and reinforced. The basement has been prepared. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of anger that he will walk back in a few minutes. Don planned this. He built this. Sarah is 18 years old on the other side of that locked door. She will not see the outside world again for a very long time. Life in the basement, the years of captivity. What follows in the film is a portrayal of life inside that underground space that is devastating in its detail. The basement is cold. It is dark. It is enclosed. It is a space that was never meant to be lived in, and yet Sarah has no choice but to live in it. Don comes down periodically. He brings food, minimal necessities, and he subjects Sarah to abuse that the film handles carefully but does not erase or minimize. The audience understands what is happening to her even when the camera does not show everything directly. Sarah fights to maintain her sense of self during these years. She has nothing, almost literally nothing, and yet she clings to whatever small sense of identity she can preserve inside that space. She keeps her mind working. She thinks about her life before the basement, about the boyfriend she had, about the future she was planning, about her mother who is somewhere above her head living an entirely different existence. The psychological toll of captivity is something the film treats with real seriousness. Sarah is not just physically trapped. The years pass. One of the most cutting aspects of the film is the way time moves forward. Birthdays come and go that Sarah spends underground. Seasons change somewhere above her that she cannot see. The world outside continues to turn, people live their lives, and Sarah is frozen beneath all of it, aging in the dark. During her captivity, Sarah becomes pregnant. This is one of the most painful and difficult aspects of her story. She gives birth in the basement, without proper medical care, without comfort, without anyone beside her who is there out of love or support. Don is the father of her children. He is the only person who enters that space. Sarah brings children into the world inside a prison, and those children are born into the same darkness that swallowed her. The conditions under which she gives birth are deeply harrowing. She has no support, no pain relief, no safety net. She does what she has to do because she has no other choice. The children born in the basement are Sarah's only source of connection, of love, of meaning during those years. She pours everything she has into them. She tries to protect them, to comfort them, to give them something resembling a normal childhood inside a space that is the opposite of normal. She tells them things, she talks to them, she tries to be everything for them that she never had in that basement. The world above, Don's double life. While all of this is happening below the house, life above ground continues in a way that is almost incomprehensible to contemplate. Don goes upstairs. He has breakfast with Janet. He talks to neighbors. He goes about his days as a husband, as a father to the other children in the house, as a member of the community. He maintains the image of a normal man with practiced ease, because Don has been building and maintaining false images his entire life. This is what he does. This is who he is. When Sarah disappears, Don has a story ready. He tells Janet and everyone else that Sarah ran away. He frames it as something that hurt him, as a father abandoned by a troubled daughter. He plays the part of the wounded parent who cannot understand why his child would leave without so much as a word. He is convincing. He has been practicing his whole life for moments exactly like this. People in the community offer him sympathy. They believe him because they have no reason not to. Sarah was a teenager who clashed with her parents. Janet is heartbroken. She misses Sarah. She worries about her. She does not know the truth because Don has taken every measure to make sure she never finds it. Janet lives her life above the basement where her daughter is imprisoned, never knowing, never suspecting, trapped in her own way inside the lie that Don has constructed around her. Then something happens that adds an almost impossible layer to the deception. Don begins bringing children upstairs. The children that Sarah gives birth to in the basement are brought up into the world above by Don, who presents them to Janet with a fabricated explanation. He tells her that Sarah has been leaving the babies on their doorstep, that Sarah cannot care for them, that Sarah wants the family to raise them. It is an explanation that should not hold together, and yet Don delivers it with such certainty and such emotional manipulation that Janet accepts it. She takes in these children. She raises them as her grandchildren. She loves them without knowing that their mother is directly beneath her feet. This is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing elements of the entire story. Don is running two families simultaneously. He is the patriarch of a household that exists in the open, and he is the jailer of a household that exists in secrecy, and he is moving between both worlds without anyone above or below fully understanding the complete picture. The level of psychological manipulation required to maintain this for the length of time he maintains it is a portrait of a very specific and varied the children, torn between two worlds. As more children are born in the basement, and some are taken upstairs to live with Janet, a heartbreaking divide opens up. Some of Sarah's children grow up in the basement with their mother. Others are taken away and grow up in the house above, raised by their grandmother who believes she is doing a good thing. The children who remain in the basement know only that world. They know the walls, the limited light, the cold, their mother. Sarah tries to be everything for them, but the reality of their existence is something no child should ever have to experience. The children who are brought upstairs live in a different version of ignorance. They are surrounded by more space, more light, more of what looks like a normal life, but they are living inside a lie of enormous proportions, connected to a mother they do not see and a grandfather who is the architect of everything that has gone wrong. Sarah's relationship with her children is the emotional core of the film. The love she has for them is the only pure and uncomplicated thing in her existence during those years of captivity. She does not blame them for the circumstances of their birth. She holds on to them and loves them with everything she has, because they are her reason to keep going. They are proof that something real and human exists inside that space despite all of Don's efforts to reduce Sarah to nothing. The crack in the wall, when the truth begins to emerge. The turning point arrives not because of anything heroic or dramatic in the traditional sense. It arrives because one of the children in the basement becomes seriously ill. The illness is significant enough that Don has no choice but to allow the child to be taken to a hospital for medical treatment. This is the moment that everything has been building toward, even if no one involved can see it clearly yet. When the child arrives at the hospital, medical professionals do their jobs. They ask questions. They look at the situation in front of them, and some of what they see does not add up. The child's medical history is practically non-existent. There are questions about where this child came from, who the parents are, what the circumstances of this child's life have been. Don cannot answer all of these questions convincingly. Investigators become involved. People start looking more carefully at Don and at his household and at the story he has been telling for years about his missing daughter who ran away. When you look at a story that carefully, inconsistencies appear that were invisible from a distance. Don is still trying to manage the situation, still trying to control the narrative the way he has controlled everything his entire life. But there are too many questions now and too many people asking them. The truth about what is happening in the basement begins to surface. It comes out not in one clean revelation but in pieces, each piece more staggering than the last. Investigators make their way to the house. They discover the basement. They discover Sarah. The discovery, Sarah comes into the light. When Sarah is found and brought out of the basement, she has spent years underground. She is a grown woman who went in as a girl on the eve of her 18th birthday. The physical reality of who she is now, and who she was before that locked door closed behind her are two very different things. She is thinner, weaker in some ways, changed profoundly by what she has endured. But she is alive. She survived. The moment she comes out of the basement and into the world is handled in the film with a kind of quiet devastation. There are no triumphant swells of music, no clean catharsis. Sarah steps into light that she has not seen in years, and the world she steps into is not the world she left. Everything has moved forward without her. She missed years of her life that she will never get back. The people around her, the investigators, the medical personnel who attend to her, are confronted with the full scope of what happened in that house. For many of them, it is incomprehensible. The scale of what Don did, the length of time he did it, the elaborate and sustained deception he maintained, all of it is almost too enormous to process. For Janet, the discovery is its own kind of shattering. She has to absorb the fact that her daughter was beneath her for all those years. The grandchildren she was raising are Sarah's children. The husband she lived with was capable of something that defies most people's understanding of human evil. The floor of her entire life drops away in that moment of truth. Everything she believed about her family, her home, her husband, turns out to have been a carefully staged, managed lie. Don faces consequences. Don is arrested. The case against him is built from the evidence that investigators gather, from Sarah's testimony, from the physical reality of the basement itself, from the children who were born there. Don, who spent years as the unchallenged authority over the lives of the people in that house, is now in a position where his authority means nothing. The film does not dwell extensively on the legal proceedings, but it makes clear that Don faces the full weight of what he has done. The man who presented himself to the world as an ordinary father, a man wronged by a daughter who ran away, is exposed for what he actually is. There is no version of the story he can tell anymore that holds together. The evidence is too overwhelming and too undeniable. The community that knew Don and believed his lies has to reckon with what it means that someone like this existed in their midst for so long without anyone seeing through the surface he presented. This is one of the deeply uncomfortable truths the film surfaces without making it into a neat moral lesson. Abusers do not look the way people expect them to look. They do not announce themselves. They live among ordinary people in ordinary places, and they do terrible things behind doors that no one thinks to open. Sarah's aftermath, the long road forward. The final portion of the film turns to Sarah and what comes after the basement. This is handled with real care and without false optimism. Sarah is not magically restored by her rescue. The years she spent underground have left marks that are not erased simply because she is now free. She has to relearn what the world is like. She has to navigate relationships with children she fought to protect in the most impossible circumstances. She has to find some way to exist in a world that moved forward for years without her. Her relationship with her mother Janet is deeply complicated. Janet did not know. Janet believed the lies. Janet loved Sarah and missed her, and suffered in her own way through the years of Sarah's disappearance. But Sarah also grew up knowing what it felt like to be controlled, to have her voice silenced, and the fact that her mother accepted the story. The film ends not with a ribbon tied neatly around everything, but with Sarah taking small and tentative steps towards something that might, in time, resemble a life. There is no suggestion that what was taken from her can be given back. There is no suggestion that the damage can be fully undone. What the film offers at its end is something quieter and more honest than a Hollywood resolution. It offers the real weight of the story. What makes the complete story of this film so devastating is not any single scene or moment, but the accumulation of everything across those years. It is the birthdays Sarah spends in the dark. It is the children born without sunlight. It is Janet eating breakfast above the basement every morning. It is Don walking through the neighborhood looking like a man who has nothing to hide. It is years of silence broken only when a sick child forces a crack in the wall that was built to never crack. The story of Girl in the Basement is ultimately a story about how evil survives. It survives not through obvious menace but through control, through manipulation, through the systematic silencing of anyone who might speak the truth. Sarah's survival is not just a physical fact. It is a profound act of endurance against a force that tried, for years, to erase her completely. That she comes out of the basement still herself, damaged and changed but still present, is the most powerful thing the film has to offer. The actors of Girl in the Basement, Complete Life Histories. Stephanie Scott. Stephanie Scott was born on December 6, 1996, in Bloomington, Illinois, a mid-sized city in the heart of the American Midwest. From the very beginning of her life, it was clear that she was a child with a natural pull toward performance. She did not grow up in a Hollywood family or in a city where the entertainment industry was part of everyday life. She came from an ordinary American background, which makes her rise to professional acting and her eventual presence in major productions all the more impressive. She showed an interest in singing and performing from a very young age, and her parents recognized early that their daughter had a genuine and unusual talent that went beyond childhood enthusiasm. Scott began her career as a child actress, navigating the path that many young performers take of auditions, small roles, and gradual building of experience. She was discovered and began working in the entertainment industry while still in her early childhood years. One of her first significant breaks came through the world of television, where she began appearing in commercials and small parts that helped her build the kind of practical on-set experience that formal training alone cannot provide. She understood instinctively how to exist in front of a camera, how to hold attention, and how to make a character feel real and inhabited rather than performed. Her major breakthrough on a wide scale came when she was cast in the Disney Channel series Auntie Farm, which premiered in 2011. In that show she played Lexi Reed, a popular and somewhat antagonistic character who served as a recurring presence throughout the series. Disney Channel at the time was one of the most powerful platforms for young performers, reaching an enormous audience of children and teenagers across the United States and internationally. Being part of a Disney Channel production at that age gave Scott visibility and recognition on a scale that most young actors take years longer to achieve. She became a familiar face to an entire generation of young viewers, and her work on Auntie Farm ran for several years, giving her sustained experience working in a television environment across multiple seasons and storylines. Even during her Disney years, Scott was developing her identity as a performer who wanted to do more than what a family entertainment platform typically offers. She was growing as an actress and thinking about the kind of work she wanted to do as she moved out of childhood roles and into more complex territory. This ambition eventually led her toward projects with considerably more dramatic weight. The role that significantly shifted the perception of her as an actress came in 2015 when she was cast in Insidious, Chapter 3, the prequel installment of the popular horror franchise produced by Blumhouse Productions and directed by Lee Hwannell. In that film she played Quinn Brenner, a teenager who becomes the target of a malevolent supernatural force after attempting to contact her deceased mother. The role required Scott to carry a significant portion of the film on her own, often performing in physically demanding and emotionally intense sequences that pushed her considerably beyond anything she had done on Disney Channel. Her performance was well received by critics and audiences who noted that she brought a genuine vulnerability and emotional authenticity to what could easily have been a standard horror film protagonist. The film was commercially successful, and Scott's work in it demonstrated convincingly that she was a serious actress capable of handling demanding material. Following Insidious, Chapter 3, she continued building her resume with additional film and television work. She appeared in the film Interlude in Prague in 2017, a period drama set in the 18th century, showing a willingness to take on diverse projects across different genres and time periods. She also worked on other television projects and continued developing her craft through every opportunity she could find. Then came Girl in the Basement in 2021, which stands as arguably the most emotionally and dramatically demanding work of her career to this point. Playing Sarah required Scott to portray a character across a span of many years, beginning as a teenager full of life and hope and moving through years of captivity, trauma, and endurance. The physical and emotional demands of the role were significant. She had to convey years of suffering, isolation, and psychological damage in a way that felt true and human rather than theatrical or exaggerated. Her performance earned widespread praise from viewers and demonstrated that she had fully arrived as a serious dramatic actress, capable of leading a film through material of genuine weight and darkness. Outside of her acting career, Stephanie Scott is also known as a musician. She has a genuine passion for music that runs parallel to her acting work, and she has released original music over the years, demonstrating a creative identity that extends beyond any single field. She has spoken in interviews about the importance of music to her as an expressive outlet, and the sincerity of her engagement with it is evident. She uses social media to connect with her audience and shares aspects of her life and creative work with a following that has grown steadily throughout her career. Scott represents a particular kind of performer, one who began in the highly visible but creatively limited world of children's television and used it as a foundation from which to build something much more substantial and serious. She is still in the relatively early stages of what promises to be a long career, and everything she has done so far suggests that the most interesting chapters of that career are still ahead of her. Judd Nelson. Judd Nelson was born on November 28, 1959, in Portland, Maine. He grew up in a family with professional accomplishments surrounding him, as his father was a lawyer and his mother was active in civic life, which gave him a background of education and seriousness from which his own path eventually diverged dramatically into the world of entertainment. He attended the exclusive St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in the United States, which placed him in an environment of academic rigor and social expectation. After his time there, he went on to study philosophy at Haverford College in Pennsylvania before ultimately making the decision to pursue acting as his life's work. He moved to New York City to study acting seriously, training under the guidance of Stella Adler, one of the most legendary acting teachers in American theatrical history. Adler's method was rooted in the tradition of emotional truth, imagination, and genuine character inhabitation, and her influence on the generations of actors she trained was profound and lasting. For Nelson, studying under Adler was formative, in a deep way. It gave him a technical. His professional acting career began building through stage work and small screen appearances in the early 1980s. He was a young man in New York trying to establish himself in a competitive field, and he worked steadily to get his name and face in front of the people who could give him larger opportunities. Those opportunities arrived in a very significant way in 1985. The year 1985 changed Judd Nelson's life entirely and permanently. That was the year The Breakfast Club was released, directed by John Hughes and produced by A&M Films and Universal Pictures. The film brought together 5 actors who would collectively define a generation of American cinema, and Nelson was at the center of it. He played John Bender, a rebellious, angry, street-smart young man from a troubled home who spends a Saturday in detention alongside 4 other students from completely different social worlds. Bender was the character who pushed hardest against authority, who provoked conflict, who used aggression as armor against a life that had given him very little to feel secure about. The character required Nelson to be simultaneously threatening and sympathetic, to make an audience understand the pain beneath the anger and the intelligence beneath the defiance. His performance in The Breakfast Club was electrifying and became one of the defining pieces of acting in 1980s American film. The film itself became a cultural landmark almost immediately upon release. It spoke to teenagers across the country in a way that felt completely true to their experience, and it did so through the performances of its cast, with Nelson's Bender standing as perhaps the most immediately striking and memorable of the 5 central characters. The image of him raising his fist in the air in the closing moments of that film became one of the most iconic images in the history of American cinema. The same year also saw him appear in St. Elmo's Fire, another film that placed him alongside a group of young actors who were collectively labeled the Brat Pack by the media. The Brat Pack was a cultural phenomenon of the mid-1980s, a loose grouping of young Hollywood performers who appeared frequently together in films and whose personal and professional lives attracted enormous media and public attention. Nelson was a central figure in this phenomenon, and for a period in the years following the height of his Brat Pack fame followed a trajectory that is not uncommon in Hollywood for actors whose initial rise is rapid and very visible. He continued working steadily throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, taking on a wide range of roles in film and television. He appeared in movies including New Jack City in 1991, in which he played a detective involved in the investigation of a powerful drug organization, a role that showed his range and his ability to operate in genres far removed from the teen drama world where he had made his name. He did television work. One of his more notable sustained television roles came with the series Suddenly Susan in the late 1990s, in which he was a regular cast member for the run of the show. Television gave him a consistent platform and a regular audience during a period when his film career was not generating the same level of attention as his 1980s peak. He approached television work with the same seriousness throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s. Nelson continued working in film and television, appearing in a long list of productions across many genres. He never stopped working, which is itself a testament to his professionalism and his commitment to the craft he trained so seriously for in his young adulthood. Some actors who reached the kind of cultural peak he reached in the 1980s find it difficult to sustain a career when that peak passes, but Nelson remained active and employable through consistent work ethic and his casting in Girl in the Basement in 2021 as Don, the controlling and deeply monstrous father at the center of the story, was a deliberate and interesting creative choice. Placing an actor who carries the warmth and nostalgia of The Breakfast Club in a role of absolute villainy creates a specific kind of dissonance that serves the film's themes well. Don is a man who presents himself as likable and normal while hiding something horrific, and having an actor whose public image is rooted in a beloved cultural artifact play that role adds a layer of unsettling complexity. Nelson's performance in the film is restrained and controlled, which makes his character all the more frightening. He plays Don not as an obvious monster but as a man utterly convinced of his own authority, and that interpretation is far more disturbing than a theatrical display of evil would be. Judd Nelson has lived a life that spans from the intellectual atmosphere of a New England boarding school through the most visible heights of 1980s Hollywood stardom, and into a long, sustained career built on genuine craft and continued dedication. He is a figure whose contribution to American popular culture through The Breakfast Club alone would secure his place in any serious account of that era, but who has continued to add to his body of work across 4 decades of professional acting. He remains one of the more interesting figures in his generation of Hollywood performers, someone whose career arc tells a story about talent, fame, time, and the enduring nature of real craft. Joely Fisher. Joely Fisher was born on October 29, 1967, in Los Angeles, California. From the very first facts of her biography, it is clear that she was born into a world where entertainment was not just a career possibility, but a family identity. Her father is Eddie Fisher, one of the biggest American pop singers of the 1950s and a figure of enormous celebrity in his era. Her mother is Connie Stevens, a singer and actress who had her own substantial career in Hollywood during the same period. Her half-sister, from her father's previous marriage, is Carrie Fisher, who became one of the most beloved actresses and writers in American cultural history through her role as Princess Leia in the Star Wars franchise and through her extraordinarily candid writing about her own life. Growing up in that family meant growing up surrounded by talent, by performance, by the entertainment industry in its most visible and glamorous form. It also meant growing up with all the complexity that comes with parents who were public figures with turbulent personal lives. Eddie Fisher and Connie Stevens did not have a conventional or stable family dynamic, and Jolie grew up navigating a world where fame and family complications were deeply intertwined. She developed her own passion for performance through music and acting from her youth, following the path that her family's world had made available, but doing so on her own terms and through her own genuine talent rather than simply coasting on her family name. Her professional career began gaining traction in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. She appeared in theater and began making inroads into television and film. Her early work established her as a capable and committed actress who brought emotional intelligence to her roles and who was able to operate across comedy and drama with equal facility. The role that brought her to the widest mainstream television audience was her part in the sitcom Ellen, which ran from 1994 to 1998 on ABC. She played Paige Clark, the best friend of Ellen Morgan, the character played by Ellen DeGeneres. The show was one of the most watched sitcoms of its era and is remembered today not only for its humor but for its historic significance. In 1997, Ellen DeGeneres' character came out as gay in an episode that became one of the most watched and most discussed television moments of the decade. The episode was a cultural watershed, and the show around it, including the performances of the supporting cast, was part of something genuinely significant in American television history. Fisher was a steady and warm presence throughout the run of the series, and her work on it gave her a level of recognition and professional credibility that opened subsequent doors in her career. She continued working in television and film throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s. She had a recurring role in the sitcom Till Death, which ran from 2006 to 2010, in which she played Joy Stark, a character who allowed her considerable comedic instincts to come to the foreground. The show gave her another sustained platform in primetime television and reinforced her identity as a performer comfortable with the specific rhythms and demands of television comedy. Alongside her acting career, Jolie Fisher has maintained a deep connection to music throughout her life. Singing is not a secondary pursuit for her but a genuine passion that runs through everything she does. She has performed musically in various contexts over the years and has spoken about the role that music plays in her life as an expressive and emotional anchor. She has also been publicly open about aspects of her personal life in ways that reflect a broader family tradition of candor. Her relationship with her late half-sister Carrie Fisher was one of genuine closeness and love, and when Carrie Fisher died in December 2016, Jolie's grief was public and visible and deeply human. She has spoken about Carrie with enormous warmth, and has been part of honoring her sister's legacy in various ways since her death. The loss of Carrie, her casting in Girl in the Basement as Janet, the mother who lives unknowingly above the basement where her daughter is imprisoned, required her to play a character caught in an almost impossible position. Janet is not complicit in what Don has done. She is herself a victim of his manipulation. But she is also a woman who accepted explanations that in retrospect are almost inconceivable to accept. Playing that character without judgment, finding the genuine humanity and the genuine victimhood in a woman who might easily be dismissed or condemned, required the kind of emotional intelligence and empathy that Fisher has developed across a lifetime of performance. Jolie Fisher represents a particular kind of Hollywood life, one that began at the very center of entertainment royalty and that built itself, through genuine work and genuine talent, into a career of real substance and real longevity. She carries the weight and the complexity of a family history that is extraordinary. Girl in the Basement, 2021, Budget Breakdown and Behind the Scenes. The honest truth about the budget. Before getting into the details, it is important to be completely upfront about something. Girl in the Basement is a Lifetime original movie, and Lifetime as a network has never publicly released an official budget figure for this specific film. Unlike major Hollywood studio productions that announce production budgets as part of their marketing campaigns, Lifetime keeps its financial details private and rarely discloses exact numbers for individual productions. So there is no confirmed official number attached to this film. However, based on everything that is publicly known about how Lifetime operates as a network, how its productions are structured, and what industry professionals have said about the economics of made-for-television movies, a very clear and detailed picture of the financial reality of this film can be put together. What viewers and critics noticed immediately upon its release was that Girl in the Basement was delivered through what many described as a low-budget standardized package of generic television drama. That audience perception is actually consistent with the financial reality of how Lifetime productions are made. The network has a business model built around producing content efficiently, quickly, and within tightly controlled cost parameters, and this film was no exception to that model. IMDb. How Lifetime movies are budgeted. To understand the budget of Girl in the Basement, you first have to understand the economics of the Lifetime network as a whole. Lifetime is not producing films the way Warner Brothers or Universal Pictures produces films. It is a cable television network that commissions a large volume of original movies every single year, typically releasing dozens of original productions across a 12-month period. To sustain that volume of output, each individual production has to be made within a budget that reflects the revenue model of cable television rather than theatrical release. Industry estimates for Lifetime original movies have generally placed most of their productions in a budget range of approximately $1 to $3 million. Some of their more ambitious productions or those involving higher profile talent have pushed toward the higher end of that range or slightly beyond it, while their standard productions often fall closer to the lower end. Girl in the Basement, based on everything about how it was made, most likely fell somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 million when accounting for the combination of recognizable cast members and the subject matter that required careful and sensitive handling. This kind of budget is genuinely tiny by Hollywood feature film standards. For context, a mid-range Hollywood studio film in 2021 might carry a budget anywhere from $20 million to $100 million. A major blockbuster might be $300 million or more. A $2 to $3 million production is working in an entirely different financial universe, and every department on set feels that constraint in practical ways every single day of filming. What a low budget actually means on set. When a film is made on a Lifetime-level budget, the practical realities of production are very different from what most people imagine when they think of a movie being made. The shooting schedule is one of the clearest indicators of the financial constraints. Major Hollywood films might shoot for 60, 80, or even 100 days. Lifetime movies are typically shot in 12 to 15 days. Some productions push that slightly, but the general expectation is that the entire film needs to be captured extremely quickly. Girl in the Basement, running at 88 minutes of finished content and covering a story that spans decades, was shot on exactly this kind of compressed schedule. What that means for everyone involved is an intense, relentless pace of work. The director, Elizabeth Rome, would have been making rapid decisions on set every day. There is no luxury of shooting a scene 20 different ways and picking the best one in editing. When you are on a Lifetime schedule, you get the scene done and the takes available and you move on. Rome, who was both an actress and director and therefore understood both sides of what was being asked of the cast, had to balance creative quality with the brutal efficiency that the budget demanded. The crew on a production like this is also much smaller than on a Hollywood film. There are no massive departments with dozens of people. The camera department, the lighting department, the art department, all of them are working lean. The people who build and dress the sets are doing so with limited resources, which is actually part of why some audience members noted that the basement set looked quite simple and sparse. That simplicity was not necessarily just a creative choice. It was also a reflection of what the budget allowed the art department to construct and dress within the available time and money. The basement set, building the prison on a budget. The basement itself, which is the central physical space of the entire film and the location where a huge portion of the story takes place, is worth discussing in detail because it reveals a lot about how the production operated. Building a convincing subterranean prison on a limited budget is a genuine challenge. The set designers had to create a space that felt claustrophobic, oppressive, and believably lived in across a span of years, while working with materials and a construction budget that had clear limits. Some audience members pointed out that the bunker had only cement floors, and that the captives were seldom shown wearing shoes and were sometimes seen sleeping on bare concrete, which they noted would be extremely difficult for normal humans to sustain. Whether this was a creative decision or a production limitation or some combination of both is hard to say definitively, but it gives you a sense of how the physical environment of the set was constructed and what it looked like to people watching closely. IMDb. The house used for the above-ground portions of the film was also not a purpose-built set. Like most Lifetime productions, the crew would have used a practical location, meaning an actual existing house that was dressed and modified to serve the story. Filming in a practical location rather than building sets from scratch saves significant money but comes with its own complications. The rooms are the size they are, the layout is fixed, and the lighting conditions are often challenging. The production team has to work around all of those practical realities while still trying to make the film look as good as possible within the frame. The cast salaries and what they tell us. Another way to understand the budget of a film is to look at its cast and think about what their involvement would cost. Judd Nelson, as a veteran actor with a long career and genuine name recognition, would have commanded the highest individual salary on this production. For a Lifetime original movie, even a recognizable name does not come with the kind of payday that Hollywood features offer. Actors who work in the Lifetime space often do so because they appreciate the work, because the shooting schedule is manageable, or because the story appeals to them, rather than because the financial compensation is exceptional. Reports and industry standards suggest that lead actors in Lifetime movies can earn anywhere from $50,000 to a few $100,000 depending on their profile and negotiating position. Stephanie Scott, who carries the film and delivers the most demanding performance, would have been compensated relative to her position in the industry at that time. Jolie Fisher, with her television background and name recognition, would similarly have been paid within the parameters that a Lifetime budget allows. None of these numbers approach what major studio productions pay their leads, and the actors who take Lifetime projects generally understand and accept that going in. What is interesting is that despite these financial realities, several reviewers noted that Judd Nelson's portrayal of the father seemed disturbingly real, and that Stephanie Scott's performance was far stronger than the material around her might have warranted. These are professionals who brought genuine commitment to their work regardless of what the budget looked like. IMDb. Funny and light-hearted moments behind the scenes. Now here is where things get genuinely interesting, because making a film about a subject this dark and this emotionally heavy creates a very specific kind of on-set culture that is quite different from what people might expect. When you are filming deeply serious and disturbing material day after day on a compressed schedule, the cast and crew absolutely have to find ways to release tension, to laugh, and to remind themselves and each other that they are human beings making a film rather than people actually living through the events they are depicting. This is a universal truth of filmmaking, and it applies in full to Girl in the Basement. One of the most talked about dynamics on set would inevitably have been the contrast between Judd Nelson the person and Don the character. Nelson is, by all accounts from people who have worked with him over the years, a warm and funny individual with a sharp wit and a genuine sense of humor that comes from decades of surviving in Hollywood. He has been in the industry since the early 1980s. He has seen everything. He approaches his work with a kind of dry, experienced perspective that only comes from a very long career. And here he was, playing one of the most despicable human beings ever written for a Lifetime movie, showing up on set to play an absolute monster, and then between takes presumably cracking jokes and being completely himself. That gap between character and person on set with someone like Nelson would have been a constant and probably very funny source of contrast for everyone around him. The specific irony of Judd Nelson playing a villain was not lost on the cast or the people following the film's production. Here is the man who raised his fist in the air at the end of The Breakfast Club, an image that literally became one of the defining symbols of teenage rebellion and freedom in American cinema, and he is now playing a man who locks a teenager away and destroys her freedom completely. Everyone on that set would have been aware of that irony, and it almost certainly came up in conversation. Nelson himself, with his sense of humor and his awareness of his own cultural legacy, would likely have found the irony very funny to acknowledge. You can imagine a moment between takes where someone brings up The Breakfast Club and the entire crew just loses it for a minute before getting back to the very serious business of making this film. Stephanie Scott, who is known from interviews and social media interactions as someone with a bright and energetic personality and a genuine sense of humor, would have been navigating a similar kind of internal contrast throughout the shoot. She was playing a character going through years of unimaginable suffering while being a young woman in her early 20s who is naturally warm and funny and full of energy. The way actors manage that kind of contrast on a daily basis often involves humor, self-awareness, and a lot of what people in the industry call shaking it off between takes. There are almost certainly moments from the set of this film where Stephanie Scott went from the emotional intensity of a difficult scene to laughing about something completely mundane the moment the director called cut. Joely Fisher, who comes from a background in sitcom television and has spent significant portions of her career in comedic roles, would have been a natural source of lightness on set. Someone with her comedy experience understands instinctively how to read a room and how to offer the kind of humor that breaks tension without undercutting the seriousness of the work. Having Fisher on a set that was dealing with this kind of material would have been genuinely valuable not just for her performance, but for the atmosphere she created around her. Director Elizabeth Rome, who as an actress herself understands what cast members need emotionally, would have been managing the tone of the set with real awareness. Making sure that the actors doing the most difficult emotional work had space to breathe, to laugh, and to decompress between takes is a significant part of a director's job when the material is this heavy. Rome would have been creating those spaces deliberately, and would have been part of the lighter moments that helped everyone get through the days. One of the genuinely funny behind-the-scenes realities of any Lifetime production, and this one would have been no exception, is the speed at which everything moves. When you have 12 to 15 days to shoot an entire film, there is a particular kind of barely controlled chaos that becomes the daily reality of the set. People are moving fast, decisions are being made rapidly, setups are changing constantly, and the pressure to stay on schedule is absolutely relentless. That kind of pressure environment inevitably produces funny moments. Not because anyone is trying to be funny, but because when humans are working at that pace and under that pressure, absurd things happen. Props are in the wrong place. A line gets flubbed in an unexpected way. Something in the set does not work the way it was supposed to. Someone walks into frame who was not supposed to be there. These small disasters of fast filmmaking become the funny stories that cast and crew carry with them after the production wraps. The basement set specifically, which was a confined and physically somewhat uncomfortable space to film in, would have produced its own particular set of behind-the-scenes moments. Filming in tight, enclosed spaces is notoriously challenging. Camera operators have limited room to work. Lighting is complicated. The actors are physically close together in ways that can feel awkward between takes even when the scene itself requires that closeness for dramatic reasons. Anyone who has ever worked on a film set in a small practical location knows that these conditions produce a kind of forced intimacy and comedic awkwardness that the cast and crew typically handle by laughing about it together. The bigger picture of what the budget achieved. Despite all the financial constraints, the film was considered well made with very good performances across the board by a significant portion of its audience, which is genuinely remarkable when you understand what it was working with. Making a film that deals with decades-spanning captivity, multiple characters aging across 20 years, a complex emotional story, and deeply sensitive subject matter, all within a lifetime television budget and a compressed shooting schedule, is an achievement that deserves recognition even when the results are imperfect. IMDb. The film held the attention of many viewers well enough despite its budgetary limitations, and the performances of the lead cast were widely acknowledged as stronger than the production circumstances might have guaranteed. That is ultimately the most interesting thing about the budget conversation surrounding Girl in the Basement. The money was limited. The time was limited. The resources were limited. And yet the people involved, the director, the cast, the crew working long days on a tight schedule, produced something that reached an enormous audience, sparked significant conversation, and did genuine justice to a story that deserved to be told. IMDb. That combination of limitation and commitment is in many ways the defining story of Lifetime original movies as a form, and Girl in the Basement is one of the clearer examples of what that form can achieve when the right people are involved and everyone decides to give it everything they have regardless of what the budget says. Girl in the Basement, 2021, Cultural and Historical Details. The historical foundation, the real case that shocked the world. To understand the cultural and historical weight that Girl in the Basement carries, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the film, but the beginning of the real story that made the film necessary. The events that inspired this movie did not happen in America. They happened in a small, quiet town in Austria called Amstetten, located in the northern part of the country in the region of Lower Austria. Amstetten is not a dramatic or unusual place. It is an ordinary European town with a modest population, a town that exists in the kind of quiet obscurity that most small European cities occupy. Nothing about it on the surface suggested that something of historical magnitude was unfolding within its borders. Joseph Fritzl was an Austrian man who, in 1984, lured his daughter Elizabeth into the basement of their family home at 40 Strasse and locked her inside a specially constructed underground dungeon that he had built and expanded over a period of years. Elizabeth was 18 years old when she was imprisoned. She remained in that basement for 24 years, until 2008, when the case finally came to light. During those 24 years, she gave birth to 7 children, all fathered by Joseph. 1 child died shortly after birth. 3 children were raised in the basement with their mother throughout her captivity. 3 others were brought upstairs by Joseph, who told his wife Rosemary that Elizabeth had abandoned the babies on their doorstep. When the case was uncovered in April of 2008, it became one of the most globally reported and globally discussed criminal cases of the modern era. The revelation of what had happened in that basement sent shockwaves through Austria, through Europe, and through the entire international community. It was not simply the horror of the crime itself, though that horror was profound and nearly incomprehensible. It was everything surrounding the crime that made it a cultural and historical event of real significance. It was the question of how this happened. It was the question of how it went undetected for nearly a quarter of a century. It was the question of what it said about family structures, about community responsibility, about the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable people, and about the ability of a single individual to construct and maintain a world of absolute deception for an almost unimaginable length of time. Joseph Fritzl was arrested in 2008 and stood trial in 2009. He was convicted of murder by negligence in the death of one of the children, of incest, of rape, of coercion, of false imprisonment, and of slavery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and was ordered to be held in a forensic psychiatric facility. He has remained imprisoned since his conviction. Elizabeth Fritzl and her surviving children were given new identities and relocated to an undisclosed location in Austria, where they have been attempting to rebuild their lives in private, away from the press and the public that their case attracted. Austria's cultural reckoning. The Fritzl case did not just shock the world from the outside. It forced Austria into a deeply uncomfortable internal reckoning with itself. Austria has a complicated relationship with its own history, a history that includes the experience of National Socialism during the Second World War, a history in which questions of collective guilt, collective silence, and the willingness of communities to look away from uncomfortable truths have been part of the national conversation for decades. When the Fritzl case emerged, many Austrian commentators and cultural critics pointed to a cultural tendency toward what they described as a kind of enforced normality, a cultural pressure to maintain the appearance of respectability and domestic order that could, in extreme circumstances, allow something as horrific as what happened in that Amstetten basement to go unseen for years. Austria's chancellor at the time, Alfred Gusenbauer, publicly apologized on behalf of the country after the case came to light, acknowledging the collective failure that the case represented. This was a significant and historically notable moment, a head of state acknowledging that a crime of this magnitude was not simply the act of one individual, but a failure of the systems and communities that surrounded that individual. The international press, particularly in Britain and Germany, published extensive analysis of what the Fritzl case said about Austrian society, and Austria's response to those analyses was itself part of the cultural story of the case. The town of Amstetten itself became a subject of intense international media scrutiny in a way that its residents found deeply painful and deeply unwelcome. The house at 40 Ibstrasse became a destination for journalists and curious visitors from around the world, which was a source of distress for the community. The house was eventually demolished in 2013, a decision that reflected the community's desire to erase the physical reminder of what had happened there, to reclaim the ordinary character of the street and the neighborhood from the shadow that the case had cast over it. How the case entered global cultural consciousness. The Fritzl case entered global cultural consciousness in 2008 at a moment when the Internet and 24-hour news media had created a world where major stories could spread instantly across national borders and reach an audience of hundreds of millions within hours. The case was everywhere simultaneously. It was on television news in America, in newspapers in Britain, in magazines in Germany, in online discussions in countries that had no direct connection to Austria whatsoever. It became one of those stories that everyone in the world seemed to be talking about at the same time, a rare occurrence even in an era of global media connectivity. The cultural response to the case took many forms. Journalists wrote detailed investigative accounts of how the crime was committed and how it went undetected. Psychologists and psychiatrists were consulted by media organizations around the world to explain how Joseph Fritzl's psychology worked, what kind of person was capable of doing what he did, and what warning signs might have been visible in retrospect. Criminologists examined the structural failures, the moments when authorities or social services were in contact with the Fritzl family and did not see what was happening. All of this expert commentary entered the public conversation and became part of the cultural framework through which the case was understood. Fiction also responded to the case. Emma Donoghue, the Irish-Canadian author, read about the Fritzl case and other similar cases of captivity and wrote the novel Room, published in 2010, which told the story of a woman held captive in a single room and the young son she had raised there. Donoghue was careful to create a fictional world distinct from the specifics of any single real case, but the cultural moment that produced Room was clearly shaped by the Fritzl case and others like it. Room was adapted into a film in 2015, directed by Lenny Abrahamson and starring Brie Larson, who won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance. Room is often referenced alongside Girl in the Basement when people discuss this category of stories because both draw from the same cultural and historical well, even though they approach that material in very different ways and at very different budget levels. The cultural history of Lifetime as a network. Understanding Girl in the Basement also requires understanding the cultural history of the Lifetime network itself, because the film exists within a very specific cultural tradition that Lifetime has been building and refining for decades. Lifetime was launched in 1984 as a cable television network with a specific focus on programming aimed at women. From the very beginning, its identity was built around stories about women's lives, women's experiences, and the particular challenges and dangers that women face in the world. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Lifetime built a reputation for making television movies based on real events, particularly events involving crimes against women, domestic abuse, captivity, and survival. These films were sometimes dismissed as sensationalistic or as simple entertainment dressed up in the clothing of serious social commentary. But there was always something more complicated happening in the cultural conversation around Lifetime movies. They were reaching an audience of millions of women who recognized in these stories elements of experiences they had lived or witnessed or feared. The films gave cultural shape and narrative form to experiences that often went unspoken in public life. By the time Girl in the Basement was made in 2021, Lifetime had been in this business for nearly 4 decades. The network had developed what amounted to a cultural formula for this kind of film, a formula that critics often pointed to as a limitation but that also represented a kind of cultural consistency, a reliable approach to telling stories that its audience understood and trusted. The ripped from the headlines label that Lifetime applied to many of its productions, including Girl in the Basement, was itself a cultural marker that told the audience something specific about the relationship between the story they were about to see and the real events that inspired it. Domestic abuse awareness and cultural timing. Girl in the Basement arrived in February of 2021 within a specific cultural moment that gave it additional resonance. The years between the Me Too movement in 2017 and the film's release in 2021 had been a period of enormous cultural upheaval around questions of abuse, power, consent, and the ways in which institutions and communities enable abusers to operate without accountability. The Me Too movement had forced a public reckoning with the prevalence of abuse across industries and institutions, and that reckoning had created a cultural climate in which stories about abuse and survival were being heard and received differently than they might have been even a decade earlier. When Girl in the Basement aired in February 2021, it was reaching an audience that had spent several years actively engaged in public conversations about exactly the themes the film addresses. The idea that an abuser can live in plain sight while the community around him remains completely unaware. The idea that victims are often silenced not just by their abusers but by the social structures surrounding them. The idea that the appearance of normalcy can mask something deeply and violently wrong. All of these themes resonated in the post-Me Too cultural environment in ways that made the film feel immediately relevant rather than simply historical. The film also arrived during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, when large portions of the global population had spent months confined to their homes. While the comparison is in no way equivalent to what Sarah experiences in the film, the cultural experience of lockdown and confinement gave many viewers an additional if incomparably distant frame of reference for thinking about what it means to be unable to leave a space, to be cut off from the outside world, to have the boundaries of one's existence reduced to the walls of a single location. The cultural representation of fatherhood and family. One of the most historically significant and culturally challenging aspects of the Fritzl case, and by extension of Girl in the Basement, is what it forces its audience to confront about the institution of family and the cultural authority of the father figure. In Western culture, and particularly in the cultural traditions of Central Europe where the real case took place, the father has historically been positioned as the protector of the family, the authority figure whose role is to keep the household safe and to provide for its members. Joseph Fritzl, and Don in the film, weaponize exactly this cultural position. Don's power in the film is inseparable from his cultural position as father and husband. He is believed by his wife, by his neighbors, by the community, in large part because the cultural template of the protective patriarch is so deeply embedded in the social imagination that it becomes very difficult for people to see past it. This is not a problem unique to any single culture or historical period. The authority of the father figure has been used to conceal abuse in families across cultures and across centuries of human history. What the Fritzl case and the film based on it do is bring that historical reality into the most extreme possible focus, confronting the audience with the full horror of what the misuse of paternal authority can produce when it is combined with the kind of psychological pathology that Joseph Fritzl represented. The film also participates in a long cultural and historical tradition of stories about the hidden underside of domestic life, about the gap between what a household presents to the outside world and what actually happens within its walls. This tradition runs through literature, through theater, through cinema, through true crime as a genre. The idea that the home, which is culturally constructed as a place of safety and refuge, can be the site of the most extreme and sustained violence, is one of the most disturbing and culturally resonant themes in Western storytelling. Girl in the Basement operates squarely within this tradition and draws its cultural power from the accumulated weight of every story that came before it in that lineage. The film's place in the history of true crime storytelling. Girl in the Basement exists within the broader cultural history of true crime as a storytelling form, a form that has experienced an extraordinary period of growth and mainstream cultural prominence in the decade or so before the film was made. The rise of true crime podcasts, true crime documentary series, and true crime dramatizations on streaming platforms and cable television in the 2010s created a cultural appetite for stories based on real events that was larger and more mainstream than anything that had existed before. True crime as a genre has always attracted criticism alongside its enormous audience. The criticism focuses on the ethics of turning raw people's suffering into entertainment, of the potential for exploiting victims and their families, and of the way that the genre can sometimes prioritize sensation over genuine understanding. These criticisms applied to Girl in the Basement, and were raised by some viewers and critics upon its release. The question of whether it is appropriate to make a Lifetime movie out of the experiences of Elizabeth Fritzl, who is a real and living person who suffered unimaginably and who has never publicly consented to having her story told in this form, is a genuine ethical question that the film cannot fully resolve. At the same time, the true crime tradition that the film participates in has a long history of bringing important social issues to public attention, of giving cultural form to experiences that might otherwise remain invisible, and of reaching audiences who would never encounter this material through academic or journalistic channels. The tension between these two aspects of the true crime tradition, its ethical complications and its genuine social value, is part of the cultural context within which Girl in the Basement has to be understood. The legacy of the film in popular culture. In the years since its premiere in February 2021, Girl in the Basement has developed a significant cultural afterlife. It became one of the most watched Lifetime original movies of its year and generated extensive discussion on social media platforms, particularly among younger audiences who were encountering the Fritzl story for the first time through the film. This is itself a historically significant function of the film. For a generation that did not follow international news in 2008, Girl in the Basement may have been the first point of contact with one of the most important criminal cases of the early 21st century. The film's success also contributed to Lifetime's ongoing development of what became known as the Girl in franchise, a series of films that dealt with similar themes of female captivity and survival. The cultural appetite that Girl in the Basement tapped into was large enough and consistent enough that the network recognized it as the foundation for a continuing strand of programming. This places the film not just as an individual cultural product but as the originating point of a small but genuine cultural phenomenon within the world of Lifetime programming. The performances, particularly Stephanie Scott's work as Sarah, entered the cultural conversation about what Lifetime movies could be when they were taken seriously by everyone involved. The film became a reference point in discussions about the quality ceiling of made-for-television drama and about how even limited budgets and compressed schedules could produce work of genuine emotional impact when the right people were committed to the material. What the film says about its cultural moment. Ultimately, Girl in the Basement is a cultural document as much as it is a film. It reflects the moment it was made in, a moment of heightened awareness about abuse, about the failures of systems designed to protect vulnerable people, about the gap between public image and private reality, and about the particular cultural mechanisms that allow abusers to operate without detection. It reflects the Lifetime Network's decades-long commitment to bringing stories about women's experiences to a mass audience regardless of the prestige or the budget attached to them. It reflects the enduring cultural fascination with the Fritzl case and the questions that case raised about human nature, family, community, and institutional failure. And it reflects something perhaps most fundamentally human of all: the need to tell difficult stories. The need to take experiences of suffering and endurance, and give them narrative form, to make them visible, to make them part of the shared cultural conversation rather than leaving them buried in silence. Whatever its limitations as a piece of filmmaking, Girl in the Basement participates in that deeply human and deeply historical impulse, and it does so within a tradition of storytelling that stretches far beyond the walls of any single basement on any single street in any single country. The case that changed history. There are certain criminal cases in modern history that do not simply shock the public and then fade into the background of collective memory the way most news stories do. There are certain cases that permanently alter the way societies think about family, about law, about institutional responsibility, and about the capacity for human evil to exist in the most ordinary and unremarkable of environments. The Fritzl case is one of those rare events. It belongs to a very small category of historical moments that genuinely change things, that force governments, legal systems, communities, and ordinary people to look at the world differently after the truth came out than they had before it. Girl in the Basement, as a dramatization of that case, is therefore not simply a television movie. It is a film connected to one of the genuinely iconic criminal and social histories of the modern era, and understanding those historical connections transforms the way the film sits in the mind of any viewer who encounters it with that full context. The real events began in 1984 in Amstetten, Austria. This was a year with its own significant historical context. The world in 1984 was still in the grip of the Cold War. Europe was divided between East and West. Austria, as a neutral nation situated geographically between those two worlds, occupied a particular kind of political and cultural position. It was a country that prided itself on stability, on order, on the maintenance of a particular kind of post-war European respectability. The image Austria projected to the world in 1984 was of a cultured, orderly, prosperous nation with a famous musical heritage, spectacular alpine landscapes, and a commitment to the kind of civic normalcy that the devastation of the Second World War had made all Europeans desperate to rebuild and protect. It was into this carefully maintained image of orderly normalcy that Joseph Fritzl built his underground prison. The house in Amstetten sat on an ordinary street. The family that lived there was known to neighbors as an ordinary family. Joseph Fritzl himself was known in the community as a respectable man, an engineer, a property owner. The historical and cultural irony of what was happening beneath the surface of that ordinary Austrian life became one of the most discussed aspects of the case when the truth finally emerged 24 years later. The long history of hidden crimes and the concept of the dungeon. The history of human captivity is one of the darkest chapters in the full sweep of human civilization, and it stretches back not decades or centuries but millennia. The concept of imprisoning another person, of reducing a human being to a state of complete physical dependency and total loss of freedom, is as old as civilization itself. Ancient empires used captivity as a tool of conquest and control. Medieval dungeons were places of both punishment and political elimination, where rulers disposed of enemies and inconvenient relatives by sealing them away from the world. The word dungeon itself comes from the French word donjon, meaning the central tower of a medieval castle, which was often the place where prisoners were held in conditions of extraordinary deprivation. What made the Fritzl case historically distinctive was not the mere fact of captivity, horrific as that was. What made it historically remarkable was the domestic context in which it occurred. This was not a political prison. It was not a state-sanctioned facility. It was a family home, and the captor was the father of the captive. The crime was committed not by a stranger or an institution but by someone occupying the most intimate and supposedly protective relationship in human social life. This placed the Fritzl case in a specific and historically significant category of crimes, those that occur within the family unit and that are made possible precisely by the trust, authority, and access that family relationships provide. Throughout history, the home and the family have been understood as the primary unit of human social organization and the primary site of protection and safety. Legal systems across human history have generally treated the home as a sanctuary, a private space into which external authority intrudes only reluctantly, and under specific conditions. This legal and cultural tradition, which has deep roots in Roman law, in common law traditions, in the legal frameworks of virtually every civilization that has ever existed, created a historical environment in which abuse within the family was systematically underreported, under-investigated, and under-prosecuted. The idea that what happened within a family's home was a private matter, not subject to the scrutiny of outsiders or the intervention of legal authorities, has been one of the most historically persistent and historically damaging ideas in the entire field of human rights. The historical pattern of similar cases. The Fritzl case did not emerge from a historical vacuum. In the years immediately preceding and following it, a number of other cases with similar elements came to light around the world, creating a pattern that historians, criminologists, and social scientists began to examine as something more than coincidence. These cases collectively formed a historical moment in which the extreme end of domestic captivity became visible to the public in an unprecedented way. In 1991, in Lacey, Washington, in the United States, a woman named J.C. Dugard was abducted at the age of 11 by a man named Philip Garrido while walking to her school bus stop. She was held captive for 18 years, until 2009, when Garrido's behavior at a University of California Berkeley campus attracted the attention of campus police, and the case finally unraveled. During those 18 years, J.C. gave birth to 2 daughters fathered by Garrido. She was held in a concealed backyard compound of tents and outbuildings that existed within what appeared to be a normal residential property. Neighbors noticed nothing for nearly 2 decades. Garrido, like Fritzl, had a public face and a community presence that concealed what was happening within the boundaries of his property. The Garrido case and the Fritzl case, occurring on different continents and within entirely different cultural contexts, shared a set of structural elements that made them both historically significant beyond their individual horror. In both cases, an ordinary residential property was used as a prison. In both cases, the captor maintained a normal social existence for years while the captivity continued. In both cases, children were born during the captivity. In both cases, the discovery came not through the work of law enforcement proactively identifying the crime but through a series of events that forced the crime into a context where it could no longer be concealed. In Austria itself, the Fritzl case was not even the only major case of its kind to emerge in 2008. Around the same time, the case of Natascha Kampusch was still very much in the public consciousness. Kampusch had been abducted in Vienna in 1998 at the age of 10 and held in a concealed cellar beneath the garage of her captor, Wolfgang Pricklepil, for 8 years. She escaped in 2006, just 2 years before the Fritzl case came to light. The emergence of two such cases from the same small European country within a relatively short period of time was historically extraordinary, and contributed significantly to the soul-searching that Austrian society underwent during that period. The legal and institutional history of failure. One of the most historically significant aspects of the Fritzl case, and one that Girl in the Basement touches on through its portrayal of how Don maintained his deception for years without anyone seeing through it, is the failure of the legal and social institutions that should theoretically have provided protection. This institutional failure was not simply a feature of the Fritzl case. It was a pattern with a long historical pedigree that the case brought into extraordinary focus. When Elizabeth Fritzl disappeared in 1984, her mother Rosemary reported her missing. Austrian authorities investigated and accepted Joseph Fritzl's explanation that his daughter had run away and joined a religious cult. Elizabeth had apparently left a letter, which Joseph Fritzl had forced her to write before imprisoning her, which he produced for authorities as evidence that she had gone voluntarily. The authorities accepted this explanation and the investigation was closed. Over the following years, Joseph Fritzl continued to have contact with Austrian authorities in various contexts. When the children he brought upstairs were registered with local services, when questions arose about the unusual circumstances of the family, there were moments when a more probing institutional response might have led to the discovery of what was happening in the basement years earlier than it was actually discovered. These institutional failures were examined in detail after the case came to light, and the examination revealed a historical pattern of underfunded social services, insufficient training for recognizing signs of concealed abuse, and a cultural reluctance to intrude into what was perceived as private family business. After the Fritzl case became public, Austria undertook a series of legal and institutional reforms specifically aimed at addressing the failures the case had revealed. Changes were made to the way missing persons reports were handled. Changes were made to social services protocols. Changes were made to the way authorities were trained to investigate cases involving family members where something seemed inconsistent or unclear. These legal and institutional changes represent one of the most concrete historical legacies of the real case behind Girl in the Basement, a set of policy changes that came directly out of the horror of what happened in that Amstetten basement, and that were intended to make similar situations harder to conceal and easier to detect in the future. The historical context of women's rights and domestic abuse law. Girl in the Basement, and the historical case it is based on exist within a much longer history of how societies have legally and culturally defined and addressed the abuse of women within the domestic sphere. This is a history that spans centuries and that has undergone dramatic transformation, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, though that transformation is far from complete. For most of Western legal history, the concept of marital rape did not exist as a legal category. The law treated the wife as subject to the husband's authority in sexual matters as a basic legal principle, and this principle was codified and maintained in legal systems across Europe and America for centuries. The first significant legal challenges to this framework did not begin until the 1970s and 1980s, and marital rape did not become a crime across all 50 American states until 1993. In Austria, the legal protections against domestic violence and sexual abuse within the family were similarly underdeveloped for much of the 20th century, and were strengthened significantly only in the decades leading up to the Fritzl case. The history of how domestic abuse has been legally defined and prosecuted is directly relevant to understanding why cases like the one depicted in Girl in the Basement were able to persist for so long without legal intervention. When the cultural and legal framework defines the home as a private space and the family as a unit into which external authority does not intrude without strong justification, and when the legal protections against abuse within that family unit are weak or poorly enforced, the conditions are created in which someone like Joseph Fritzl can do what he did. The feminist movements of the 20th century played a historically crucial role in challenging these frameworks and in pushing for the legal and institutional changes that gradually strengthened protections for women and children within the domestic sphere. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought domestic abuse into public discourse in a way that it had never been before. Activists argued that domestic violence was not a private family matter but a public issue requiring legal intervention and institutional response. This argument, which now seems self-evident, was historically radical when it was first made and met with significant resistance from both legal and cultural institutions that had long treated the domestic sphere as beyond the reach of public authority. The psychological history and the concept of coercive control. The history of how psychology has understood and defined the kind of abuse depicted in Girl in the Basement is itself a significant part of the film's historical context. The psychological mechanisms through which Joseph Fritzl was able to maintain Elizabeth's captivity for 24 years, the mechanisms through which Don maintains his control over Sarah in the film, belong to a pattern of behavior that psychologists have been working to understand and articulate for decades. The concept of coercive control was developed by sociologist Evan Stark as a framework for understanding how abusers maintain power over their victims through a combination of isolation, monitoring, degradation, and the systematic elimination of the victim's autonomy and sense of self. Stark's work, which was published in his 2007 book and which became influential in both academic and legal circles in the years following its publication, provided a framework for understanding abuse as something that goes far beyond individual acts of physical violence. Coercive control describes abuse as a pattern of behavior over time, a pattern designed to reduce the victim to a state of complete dependency and total subjugation. The Fritzl case, which came to light the year after Stark's framework was published, became one of the most extreme documented examples of coercive control in history. The case helped to bring this psychological concept into mainstream public awareness in a way that academic texts alone never could. As journalists and commentators tried to explain to their audiences how Elizabeth Fritzl survived 24 years of captivity without escaping even during moments when Joseph was absent from the basement, the concept of coercive control provided the most useful explanatory framework available. It helped people understand that captivity is not simply a physical condition but a psychological one, that the barriers keeping a captive in place are as much internal as external, and that understanding this is essential to understanding how such situations persist. This psychological history is embedded in Girl in the Basement even if the film does not explicitly use the language of coercive control. Everything about the way Don operates in the film, his systematic isolation of Sarah, his cultivation of a false public image, his manipulation of Janet, his methodical elimination of any possibility of rescue or discovery, reflects the historical understanding of abuse that psychological research has developed over decades. The historical significance of Lifetime's role in public awareness. There is a specific and historically significant cultural function that Lifetime movies have performed across the decades, and it is a function that is easy to dismiss but that deserves serious historical consideration. At various points in the history of American television, Lifetime original movies have been among the most widely seen portrayals of domestic abuse, sexual violence, captivity, and the failures of institutions to protect women from these experiences. This means that for millions of American women, the primary cultural text through which they have encountered and processed these experiences has been a Lifetime movie. This is historically significant because it tells us something important about where real public education about these issues has actually occurred. The academic literature on domestic abuse, the legal reforms in abuse law, the institutional training programs for social workers and law enforcement, all of these are critically important, but they reach limited audiences. The Lifetime movie reaches millions of people on a Saturday afternoon and brings them into contact with stories about experiences they may never have encountered in any other form of media or public discourse. When Girl in the Basement aired on February 27, 2021, it reached an audience that measured in the millions within the United States alone. For a significant portion of that audience, the film was their first encounter with the story of Elisabeth Fritzl, their first exposure to the details of what happened in that Austrian basement, and their first engagement with the questions the case raises about family, about abuse, about institutional failure, and about survival. The historical significance of that mass audience engagement with this material should not be underestimated simply because the vehicle through which it was delivered was a Lifetime television movie rather than a documentary or a prestigious film. The history of survivor stories and how they changed culture. The emergence of survivor narratives as a powerful and historically transformative form of public testimony is one of the most important cultural developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Across many different contexts, the decision of survivors of extreme experiences to speak publicly about what happened to them has had consequences that extend far beyond any individual story. In the context of sexual abuse and domestic captivity specifically, the public testimony of survivors has historically been the catalyst for the most significant legal and cultural changes in how these issues are understood and addressed. Without the survivors who found the courage to speak, the legal reforms, the institutional changes, the cultural shifts in how abuse is discussed and perceived would have been far slower in coming and far less complete than they have been. Elisabeth Fritzl herself has maintained a strict and understandable privacy since the discovery of her captivity. She has never given a public interview and has deliberately kept herself out of the media spotlight that her case attracted. This is her absolute right, and the decision to maintain that privacy is one that she has made clearly and consistently. The story of what happened to her was told publicly through the investigation and trial that followed her rescue, and the world learned the details of her ordeal through those legal proceedings rather than through her own testimony. Girl in the Basement, by dramatizing her story without her direct participation, occupies a complicated historical position. It contributes to the public understanding of an important historical case while also raising legitimate questions about the ethics of storytelling around real victims who have not consented to having their experiences dramatized. This tension is itself historically significant and is part of the broader conversation that the film's existence has generated about how survivor stories should be told, and by whom. The global impact on child protection laws. One of the most concrete and historically measurable legacies of the Fritzl case and the cultural conversation it generated is its influence on child protection legislation in various countries. The case brought into sharp focus the vulnerability of children born in conditions of captivity, children who have no birth certificates, no legal identity, no access to any of the systems designed to protect children, and no way to signal their existence to the outside world. In the aftermath of the case, several European countries reviewed and strengthened their legislation around child registration, mandatory reporting of abuse, and the legal obligations of authorities who come into contact with situations that suggest something may be wrong within a family. The European Union as a whole engaged in discussions about harmonizing and strengthening child protection standards across member states, discussions that the visibility and impact of the Fritzl case helped to motivate and sustain. In Austria specifically, the child protection reforms that followed the case were among the most significant in the country's history. New mandatory reporting requirements were introduced, placing legal obligations on professionals including teachers, doctors, and social workers to report suspicions of abuse. Funding for child protection services was increased. Training programs were expanded and improved. These concrete legislative and institutional changes represent the most direct historical legacy of the case, the ways in which the horror of what happened in Amstetten translated into specific legal and institutional reforms designed to prevent similar situations from occurring or from persisting undetected. The film as historical document. Stepping back from all of these specific historical threads and looking at Girl in the Basement in its totality, what emerges is a film that functions simultaneously as entertainment, as cultural commentary, and as a kind of historical document of the concerns and conversations of its moment. Every film that deals with real events becomes, over time, a record not just of the events it depicts but of how the society that produced it was thinking about those events at the particular moment of the film's creation. When historians and cultural scholars look back at American television drama from the early 2020s, Girl in the Basement will be part of the record of how American popular culture was processing questions about abuse, about institutional failure, about the hidden violence within ordinary domestic spaces, and about the resilience of women who survive extreme circumstances. The film captures, in its particular Lifetime way, a specific cultural moment, a moment when awareness of these issues was higher than it had ever been before, when the conversation about them was more public and more sustained than at any previous point in history, and when the appetite for stories that gave narrative form to these experiences was correspondingly enormous. That historical function, the function of giving narrative form to the concerns of a moment, and preserving them in a medium accessible to millions, is one of the oldest functions of storytelling in human history. It is what myths and legends and sacred texts did for ancient civilizations, what novels did for 19th-century societies grappling with industrialization and social change, what cinema did for the 20th century, and what television and streaming media continue to do for the 21st. Girl in the Basement, whatever its limitations as a piece of filmmaking, participates in that ancient and historically continuous human project of using story to make sense of difficult experience.